This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it. Guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast.
Let's kick some ice.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, that's everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, is, well, I'm here to talk of the stories of film, and I tend to talk about production stories, development stories, marketing stories, behind-the-scenes stories, icy stories, films with really bad cold puns in, all that kind of thing, really. The films that I tend to choose for this podcast, well, they have more of a mainstream leaning than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to punch down, I try not to do snark, I just really, even when the films aren't always great, as is the case with one of the films I'm talking about in this episode of the podcast, I just try and celebrate the fact that it's really hard to make a film, and what do you know, the people involved with all of these have managed to make a film and made one more than me. With all that preamble out the way, I'm going to crack on with the episode and play you a clip from the first of the two movies I'm talking about in this episode. I'll hand you over to Arnie.
Can you be cold, Batman? You have 11 minutes to thaw the bird. What will you do? Chase the villain or save the boy? Your emotions make you weak. That's why this day's mine. I'll kill you next time. There are numerous clips I could have picked to introduce 1997's infamous Batman and Robin, but I picked that one because I remember watching it at the cinema and thinking, well, wouldn't it be better if Arnold Schwarzenegger had the laugh of classic British comedy star Sid James in that particular clip? So before we get going, I'm going to start again. Here then is a clip from the first of the two films I'm going to talk about in this episode of Film Stories, just with a bit of added Sid James instead. Can you be cold, Batman? You have 11 minutes to thaw the bird. What will you do? Chase the villain or save the boy? Your emotions make you weak. That's why this day's mine. I'll kill you next time. Right then, we've got plenty to get through. That's 1997's Batman and Robin, directed by Joel Schumacher. Screenplay credited to Akiva Goldsman, based on Batman characters created by Bob Kane, who would die a year after this film came out. Cast for this one, well, Arnold Schwarzenegger took top billing as Mr. Freeze, George Clooney as Batman, Chris O'Donnell as Robin, Uma Thurman as Poison Ivy, Alicia Silverstone as Batgirl, Michael Gough returning as Alfred, Pat Hingle returning as Commissioner Gordon, John Glover as Dr. Jason Woodrow, and you get a cameo from Elle Macpherson for your money with this one as well. So the story of Batman and Robin inevitably goes back to 1995's Batman Forever. Now, that particular film had rebooted the Batman series. It's easy to overlook that after 1992's Batman Returns, directed by Tim Burton, the box office had dropped significantly from the 1989 film that Burton directed that introduced the modern-day Batman cinematic franchise. And so Warner Brothers wanted a reboot, brought in Joel Schumacher, who by then had had success with Falling Down for the studio, and he lightened things up. Certainly, too, after one of the criticisms of
of Batman Returns that Warner Brothers was dealing with was an awful lot of complaints off families. It was quite hard for McDonald's to flog its Happy Meals, given the darker tone of Batman Returns. So when Batman Forever hit big, and it really did hit big, it was one of the biggest movies of 1995, it didn't take long for Warner Brothers to approach Joel Schumacher again to take on a further Batman film, Batman 4. Schumacher by this stage was becoming one of Warner Brothers' most important directors, that he was alternating, this was the era where he alternated a John Grisham adaptation with a Batman film. He'd done a run that started with Falling Down, then he did The Client, then he did Batman Forever, he would go on to do A Time to Kill, then Batman and Robin, and it was just this run of hits for the studio. So Schumacher said to Film Review magazine, although he said it to lots of outlets at the time, that he was asked back very quickly to do the fourth Batman movie, and he said in the end that Warner Brothers prep work began in earnest on Batman and Robin a week before Schumacher went off to make 1996's A Time to Kill. Now, what Warner's wanted to do was to try and cut down the gap between sequels. That whilst it's commonplace now that it's a 2-year turnaround between sequels and movies in the same franchise, in the 90s, in the 80s, it was generally 3 years with the odd exception. Warner Brothers wanted to get that down to 2. It was really ahead of its time there. I mean, unless you're James Bond, that's the norm you go for now. But because Schumacher 2 had worked with pretty much the same team, or a core team since Falling Down, he was able to do that. No small feat there, really. So one of the returning personnel that he brought on to Batman and Robin was future Oscar-winning writer Akiva Goldsman. And so Goldsman would tell Variety that in the end, Batman and Robin was a totally original script that came from ideas Joel and I had on the plane ride back from a location scout in Mississippi for A Time to Kill. Now, Goldsman ended up with sole story and screenplay credit on the movie, but at the time he said, the truth is Joel and I made up the story together. It's not like I went away and came back with a script. We talked about it all the way through the shooting of A Time to Kill until together we came up with the rhythm of the piece, what was happening, where, when and to whom. Now, Joel Schumacher, the late Joel Schumacher, did a spectacular director's commentary on the DVD release of Batman and Robin where, well, let's just say he was happy to be candid. And he talks about the fact that there was enormous pressure on us from Warner Brothers to come up with things like inventions in the film that could be turned into toys. So one of the demands from the studios, not only that this had to be family friendly, but they had to have loads of tat that they'd be able to sell in Warner Brothers stores. So the reason there are so many gadgets and toys in the final cut of Batman and Robin was just that, the pressure from the studio to have stuff to sell. There was a desire too from the corporate point of view to make as kid-friendly a Batman as possible, that even Batman Forever had brought in parental complaints, and that was PG rated and deemed a bit softer. What Schumacher actually wanted to do after his success with Batman Forever was to go and do the Batman Year One story, which would have been a smaller, intimate, younger Batman, but Warner Brothers didn't want that. They wanted another huge blockbuster movie, and Schumacher said he went into this with his eyes open. It was going to be brighter, it was going to be kid-friendly, family-friendly. That was it. On that commentary as well, he talks about the fact that he declined several sequels. This is his sole sequel on his curriculum vitae. That he declined sequels to films such as St. Elmo's Fire, Flatliners and The Lost Boys. And it was only in the aftermath of making Batman and Robin he understood the problem with them. Just the inherent push to make everything bigger, 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 bigger. When it came to ideas then for what to do with the film, Schumacher took influence from his 6-year-old godson. And he went and chatted to him, and his 6-year-old godson was a huge fan of the excellent Batman animated series. And he asked his godson, who were your favourite villains in that? And he replied, Mr. Freeze and Poison Ivy. And so Schumacher went off and researched both of those characters. He binged an awful lot of Batman animated series. He went and read the comic books. And then he realised if we're going to have Poison Ivy as one of the villains, she's going to need some muscle, that she's not a physical character who can beat 7 shades out of people, and that's where they decided to introduce Bane into the film. And it very much, Schumacher's quite candid about this, in a 2-dimensional way, so he could go and beat people up on behalf of Poison Ivy. Slightly more audible than Tom Hardy's eventual portrayal of Bane, but I think we can say that Hardy's Bane ended up a lot more nuanced than the one we got in Batman and Robin.
He did also note that they were getting to the point where he felt they were running out of high-profile villains. But also against the villain story, what Schumacher wanted to do was bring a family mechanic to the film. That he was candid in interviews around the time that we'd seen a very dark Batman and lots of brooding and lots of suffering, and now it's time for him to lighten up. But one of the ways that he wanted to do that was to set a family drama against the action. Hence, you get one of the plot lines in the film is Alfred being ill, that the father figure of Bruce Wayne really is his life is threatened, and so that was really the way that the story was progressing. But the problem came, well, one of the many problems came when it came to casting, because it was pretty well known that there were problems on the set of Batman Forever, that Tommy Lee Jones wasn't sanctioning the buffoonery of Jim Carrey. Look that quote up. There is a reason I phrase it like that. But also, Schumacher and Val Kilmer didn't particularly get on. Now, there were polite stories at the time, in the aftermath of Batman Forever, that when it came to doing Batman 4, Val Kilmer wanted to slot in space to do The Saint. Now, Paramount Pictures was developing this one. It was going to be the big screen adaptation of the TV series. Kilmer had been cast in the lead, and whilst he was contractually obligated to make another Batman film, well, it's fair to say that all concerned seemed rather keen to release him from that commitment. In Schumacher's last major interview he gave in 2019, he was quite candid about this. He said, "I didn't say Val was difficult to work with on Batman Forever. I said he was psychotic." So by February 1996, the announcement then came that Val Kilmer wouldn't be returning as Batman in Batman 4. And in fact, Entertainment Weekly did a piece in the May of 1996, and it said when it was announced last February that Kilmer would not return as the Caped Crusader in the forthcoming fourth instalment of Hollywood's billion-dollar-plus movie franchise, the utter lack of public distress on the part of Warner Brothers was a sure sign that something had gone amiss for Kilmer. There was the option that they could delay the Batman film and wait for Val Kilmer to finish work on The Saint and then do Batman. But again, the stories came back about his, let's just say, how things went on the set of Batman Forever. One particular report said that after a couple of weeks of shooting, Kilmer's behaviour had eroded to the point where Schumacher says he and Kilmer had a physical pushing match. He was badly behaved, he was rude and inappropriate. I was forced to tell him that this would not be tolerated for one more second. Then we had 2 weeks where he did not speak to me, but it was bliss. So in that Entertainment Weekly story that landed in 1996, when Schumacher was asked about Kilmer's absence from Batman and Robin, and Kilmer has a different take on this story, but Schumacher said he sort of quit, we sort of fired him, it probably depends on who's telling the story. But because they were looking for a family drama to offset to sit alongside the superhero elements of the movie, well, it didn't take long to find a new Batman, that they wanted someone who could play the drama side of it. And one of the first candidates whose name was mentioned, and it wasn't a long casting process, was William Baldwin. He was said to be in the mix, but they settled on George Clooney pretty quickly. Now, Clooney at this point was just breaking into film after becoming a small screen sensation, really, off the back of the TV show ER. He appeared in 1996's From Dusk Till Dawn, written by Quentin Tarantino, directed by Robert Rodriguez. Schumacher went to see this and was really taken with Clooney. But 97 was the year that Clooney really made the jump in earnest to the big screen. He would make DreamWorks his first movie, The Peacemaker. He'd do the rom-com One Fine Day. But it was Batman and Robin that was going to be the step up. By casting George Clooney, they could have a lighter Batman, they could have someone who could play the drama, and it seemed that all things were full steam ahead. As indeed they were, really. Even the casting of the villainous role seemed surprisingly straightforward, and in fact the story that underpins a lot of Batman and Robin was it was a far calmer production than the movie before. Now, once it was decided that Mr. Freeze was going to be one of the villains in Batman 4, well, one name that was bandied around
around fairly quickly was Patrick Stewart. Now, the problem Patrick Stewart had, of course, he'd sprung to fame off the back of Star Trek The Next Generation at this stage, as well as his extensive theatre work. He too was just starting to explore cinema a bit more, but he had 3 films to get through in 1996 already, including Conspiracy Theory, starring Mel Gibson and Julia Roberts. So also linked were Ed Harris and Anthony Hopkins, but the whole project was transformed when Arnold Schwarzenegger was sounded out, was available and was interested. And so Schumacher basically, he decided to see the character of Mr. Freeze as, quote, the Terminator meets the refrigerator. And right throughout promotions, Schumacher, consummate pro, would insist that Schwarzenegger was his only choice for the role. When it came to Poison Ivy, well, there was a list there as well. And again, Entertainment Weekly rounded up a bit of tittle-tattle around this, that Julia Roberts and Demi Moore were reportedly considered for the role, but both of them would come with a $12 million price tag in 1996, and so that would have taken it above what Warner Brothers wanted to pay. It's worth noting that Arnold Schwarzenegger alone was going to cost $25 million, the biggest movie star in the world at that point, remember. And so 12 million on Poison Ivy just wasn't really an option. So Sharon Stone was mooted for a price tag of around $7 million at the time. She would go on to appear in the Catwoman movie nearly a decade later on. But Casino had earned her an Oscar nomination at this point, the Martin Scorsese film, so that was going to put her price up. Uma Thurman, meanwhile, well, she'd broken through with Pulp Fiction, and Schumacher had long been a fan of her work, going right the way back to The Adventures of Baron Munchausen, and so she suddenly bubbled to the top of the list for Poison Ivy and duly signed up on the dotted line. The character of Batgirl, well, she was written in, again, this was a response to the correspondence that Warner Brothers was getting about wanting a female hero in there. And Schumacher also figured that if you're having a female villain, it would be good long term to have a female hero to battle against her, and then that also gave some runway for the franchise to follow in the future, if that's the way they wanted to go. Alicia Silverstone had sprung through off the back of the brilliant Clueless, and she'd actually landed a production deal in her 20s off the back of it, and she was pursuing a film called Excess Baggage at the same time. And again, it's worth going back to the point that Schumacher insisted right throughout, in spite of all the tittle-tattle that was going around, that all of these people were his first choice. Now, the actual pre-production on the film would begin in October 1995, so just a couple of months after Batman Forever had been released, and whilst Schumacher was off making A Time to Kill. This was nearly a year before the cameras first rolled, and then it was in January 1996, according to producer Peter McGregor Scott, that, quote, things really started to get serious. That the sets that were designed by Barbara Ling, and say what you like about Batman and Robin, but the set design is really quite intense. I'm a huge fan of it, actually. And Barbara Ling designed those sets, and in March the construction of them got underway. The production was going to be based on the backlot at Warner Brothers and across its sound stages in Burbank. There wasn't an awful lot of outside work in this, so it was very much soundstage based. And so even before the budget had been agreed, the construction on those sets was going, because of this two-year turnaround. The museum alone, the set for that, was a 5-month build. There was also 5 months of research to come up with the ice effect that would coat Gotham City but towards the end of Batman and Robin. I don't think I'm going massively spoilery there. And they worked out that it was a fibre resin combination that was going to be required to make that ice effect. But even then, it then took several months to make enough of that combination for filming. Now, in the end, perhaps inevitably, actual physical production on Batman and Robin, the filming, started late. That it was due to get going in August of 1996, by which time A Time to Kill had come around and had proven to be another hit for Joel Schumacher and Warner Brothers. But filming didn't actually start in the end until September, started a couple of weeks late. But then conversely, Schumacher ran such an effective set on this one that principal photography wrapped up in January 1997, 2 weeks ahead of schedule and under budget. This goes again to the fact that the tight team that Schumacher had put together, that they had a shorthand between them, that even though they were filming far more action than they'd been in previous Batman films, even though there's far more effects work than in previous Batman films, they were able to get this one in the can quicker. Look around, and just the extensive sets go to just what a big physical production this was as well. I mean, Schumacher in the DVD commentary, it's worth noting, said if you look in Mr. Freeze's cavern in Batman and Robin, everything you see there they made lots of on top of, just so there would be enough for the Warner Brothers store. Warner Brothers was really looking forward to the bumper sales that it would get at its stores, with everyone rushing off to buy Batman and Robin merchandise. Now, John Glover talked about Joel Schumacher's directing style on Batman and Robin, and in particular the tonal choice that Schumacher made that he was being pushed towards by the studio. And Glover says that Schumacher would sit on a crane with a megaphone and yell before each take, "Remember everyone, this is a cartoon." And Glover said that it was hard to act because that kind of set the tone for the film. But as easy as it is to put that on Schumacher's play, that was the demand that was coming from up high. This had to be family-friendly Batman. It also led to heightened performances. I mean, there's not an awful lot of subtlety in the introduction of some of the key characters that you'd hardly get a build-up to the introduction of Mr. Freeze, for instance, before he's spitting out lines like mercy and some of the, 25, 30 puns based around cold temperature. In fact, the opening shots of the film go to the complete lack of subtlety you get here, but again, deliberate choice. So the opening shots are George Clooney's backside, George Clooney's bat nipples, a line about chicks digging the car, this is why Batman works alone, and then in effectively a couple of paragraphs into the film, Batman gets a call, there's a new villain, and there you go, there's Mr. Freeze. But again, that goes to the tone that he was being urged to set. So, in fact, there's a lovely little aside on the director's commentary when Uma Thurman does her transformation into Poison Ivy, and Schumacher just says this scene will not win the award for underacting. But again, can't put that at Thurman's door. That was what they were going for. Now, for Schwarzenegger, it was a tough shoot, this one, that he was burdened by a £50 suit. He still did most of his own stunt work. And he wouldn't shave his head for this one, so he wore a skull cap. That meant he was in the makeup trailer early, and Schumacher would just go along and just sit with Schwarzenegger before production began and just have a chat with him. And Schwarzenegger's in the makeup chair, chewing on his cigars and generally being upbeat, but would recall that this was quite a tough process for him. But again, it was mitigated to a degree by the fact he was getting $25 million for it. His Mr. Freeze costume alone, though, it's worth noting, also added $1.5 million to the budget, had 2,500 LEDs built into it. And it was quite a heavy beast to carry too. Conversely, Clooney's Batsuit, well, after 4 films, they'd worked out a way to make the Batsuit far more flexible for the actor wearing it. Difference is, they went through a lot more of them. It was much easier to break and to tear, and the story goes that Clooney went through about 50 Batsuits while making Batman and Robin. There's a making of book as well, written by Michael Singer, and there's a bit where you get these strange gorillas, almost magenta coloured gorillas appear in the film. And if you want a little bit of pub quiz trivia for you, the gorillas that you see, well, they were made from 450 Santa Claus wigs to get the effect. That the costume and production department procured these wigs, dipped them with black roots and tips, and they had to find the right Santa wigs for the gorillas to wear. I can't even believe I'm saying some of these sentences out loud. The sets themselves were huge. I mean, there was a lot of miniature work involved, but to get across the scale of what they were going for, everything had to be bigger. That the buildings of Gotham Museum of Natural History, Gotham Observatory, the Turkish Baths, they wanted to put across the effect that the buildings were as tall as they'd ever been, taller than those you'd find if you walked around New York City. And to be fair, I think particularly if you look at the observatory set, you certainly get that sense. There was a little bit of Michael J. Fox in Back to the Future about this, in that the lead actor in this movie was committed to shooting a TV series at the same time. It's pretty well known that Michael J. Fox had to shoot Back to the Future in the evenings due to his television commitments. In the case of George Clooney's commitment to ER, well, a deal was worked out whereby Clooney would shoot ER from Monday to Thursdays, and then he would go and do Batman Friday to Sundays, which bits of them bled into the other, but that was kind of the intense schedule that he was on for the duration of this one. It was said to be, though, and it's worth going back to this point, a far happier shoot. That Tommy Lee Jones and Val Kilmer had been difficult on the set. Schumacher hadn't got on particularly well with them. And as the film headed towards post-production, everything seemed to be sliding into place. Schumacher would give presentations and would talk about, the movie's on schedule, it's all looking good. The queue of people doing tie-ins and licenses, well, that was growing, and Schumacher would be charming them and all would be working. For Schwarzenegger, he'd write in his memoir Total Recall, where he talks very little about the actual making of Batman and Robin, but he would note that it was during the filming of the movie that he learnt he had to have a major heart operation in the aftermath of Batman and Robin, and that's what he would go and do. And it would be a while actually before he'd take another lead role in a film, and that would be End of Days in 1999. Whole load of stories there. It's worth noting too, actually, that of Arnie's suit, all those LEDs, the batteries that powered the suit, only lasted for 10 minutes at a time. So that added a little bit of a challenge to it all. But nonetheless, those final shots were in the can on January the 27th, 1997, after a 5-month shoot. The end of production was marked by the bat signal being projected onto the interior of the set, and it just looked like everything was going pretty much perfectly. As the film then went into post-production, it was going to cost a lot more than Batman Forever. It's worth noting that Batman Forever cost around 100 million. This was going to cost about 160 million, but it looked like a sound investment. And Warner Brothers was confident it had a good summer ahead of it. Look at the films it had queuing up that it was putting out. It had Batman and Robin, the must-see movie of the summer. It had Billy Crystal and Robin Williams together in the film Father's Day. It had Mel Gibson and Julia Roberts in Conspiracy Theory. And yet it would turn out to be quite a testing summer for the studio. Nonetheless, during post-production on Batman and Robin, Warner Brothers was confident to the point where it got Batman 5 moving right at the start of 1997, so 6 months before Batman and Robin was released. And as Schumacher told Variety, again, this was ahead of the release of Batman and Robin, a few months ago there were 12 movies being shot on the Warner Brothers lot, and Bob Daly and Terry Semel, who were then the heads of Warner Brothers, asked to see a sample reel of each film. Each director put together dailies from the film. After Bob and Terry saw ours, so they saw the footage from Batman and Robin, they ordered another script for Batman. They ordered Batman 5. Now, Akiva Goldsman said he wasn't going to do this one. He was moving on to other things. But Mark Protasevich was duly hired to write Batman 5. And he started screenwriting even before Batman and Robin was released. There was talk that Schumacher would be upgraded to get the $10 million director's fee that Richard Donner had just pocketed for making Assassins with Sylvester Stallone. And so there was just this air of confidence underpinning it all. Now, as images became released of the film, questions started to spring up. I mean, the nipples for a start, no way around this. And Schumacher addressed this with Variety. He said there was more newsprint on the nipples and codpieces than anything I've ever seen. What's wrong with our culture? He laughed. But what was proving to be a bigger problem for the movie was the emerging internet, the World Wide Web, more accurately, and sites such as Dark Horizons and Ain't It Cool News were springing up, and the test screenings of Batman and Robin that were taking place, well, people were going to these screenings and they were emailing their responses to the people behind these websites who were then putting these responses on the site, and it soon became clear that Batman and Robin was not going down well at all. The same summer, Speed 2 Cruise Control would be hit by the same thing. And there was a lot of blame put around on the websites for basically reviewing unfinished films. I think there's something to that. But conversely, it was hard to knock the fact that what some of the early correspondents were citing was not untrue. That when Batman and Robin was going before an audience, it wasn't going down very well at all. And the internet tittle-tattle was really not kind. This then got amplified by the Hollywood trade press, and at the point where Batman and Robin was heading towards release, the word of mouth was not on the good side. That it was scheduled for release on June the 20th, 1997, and it duly opened on that day, and it made $42 million on its opening weekend. It was at that point one of the biggest opening weekends of all time, certainly of the year. But the problem it had was that number was down on Batman Forever for a start, and the word of mouth soon became toxic. That the critical response for the movie, it was easy to sit here and say that everybody slagged it off, because especially now it's renowned as not one of Hollywood's finest moments, but that certainly wasn't the case. There were some positives in there, but conversely there was an awful lot of not particularly pleasant ink being sent in Batman and Robin's direction, which was backing up those early internet reports and giving some of those websites credence that not all of them necessarily deserved, I'd suggest. Nonetheless, the impact was being felt by the time Batman and Robin got to its second weekend at the box office, and its box office just fell off a cliff. Now, it's now commonplace that a film opens with a big number and then there's an expectation that it drops by 60 odd % in its second week, well, in pre-COVID times anyway. Batman and Robin, though, it fell by 63% in its second weekend at the US box office, and whereas previous Batman films had gone on to make somewhere in the region of $150-200 million, Batman and Robin, by its second weekend, it had just done 15 million, and it was falling fast, and in the end in the US it would do $107 million total. Overseas it would only add $130 million, and as a result it came in far below the grosses of Batman Forever, and well, it effectively at that point killed the franchise. As such, the blame game really began. That Schumacher in particular took a lot of flack, and he would change his movie making plans afterwards. He'd had a choice of making either John Grisham book The Runaway Jury into a film afterwards. He was also toying with bringing Dreamgirls to the screen. Both of those projects would end up made the decade after by other people, and Schumacher would retreat, and he wouldn't be Warner Brothers' go-to director. He would in fact go on to make the film he'd make in the aftermath of this would be 8mm, starring Nicolas Cage, a huge tonal shift and a very deliberate one. George Clooney, meanwhile, well, he's always good value when he's doing an interview about Batman and Robin, but he continually jokes about how he killed the franchise. And it was true to a point, even though it came back. That Batman 5, that had effectively been greenlit, well, that was abandoned in the aftermath of the critical response to Batman and Robin. Clooney dropped out anyway of making another one. There was a Robin spin-off that had been planned. In fact, there were two different Batman sequels that were in various stages. There was Batman Unchained, there was a Batman Triumphant, there was the Scarecrow possibly coming in, there was Superman Lives that was going to possibly cross over. All of these fell in the aftermath of Batman and Robin's releases. Where the film actually enjoyed a bit more success was on the burgeoning DVD format at the time. That DVD was breaking through in 1996 and 1997, but there weren't an enormous amount of releases, and so Warner Brothers, which aggressively backed DVD, put Batman and Robin out, and as a home cinema workout disc, it was terrific. That a lot of the quality of those early DVD releases was on the variable side, not in the case of Batman and Robin, whose pitch quality and sound quality, well, was just really, really strong. And it goes to the fact, clearly cloaked by the fact that it's part of a major franchise, that it's still a film that sells discs for Warner Brothers. I mean, they've done an Ultra HD 4K version of it. But of course, the Batman and Robin story would be what paved the way for the full-on reboot of the saga. That Darren Aronofsky for a while would toy with doing Batman Year One, the story that Schumacher wanted to do, but eventually Warner Brothers tapped a bloke on the shoulder by the name of Christopher Nolan and invited him to Gotham City. Wonder what happened with that. Perhaps we'll tell that story another time. Which brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. I am delighted to say as well that this episode is once again being sponsored by the wonderful folks at Mutiny Shaving. Now, Mutiny Shaving is an eco-friendly shaving company. They have social media tags and everything. You can find them on Twitter at Mutiny Shaving. They've got a hashtag, which I still haven't got. I need to get myself a hashtag. Their hashtag is Join the Mutiny. You can find their website at mutinyshaving.co.uk. If you're interested in sponsoring this podcast as well, I'm Simon at filmstories.co.uk. What I really love about Mutiny Shaving is that they've just been such supporters of our work and believe in the ethos of opportunity. We're trying trying to offer to writers breaking through. And so their sponsorship money is being put into our website, where we're paying new writers to write things. It'll never catch on, this approach. Have I said Mutiny Shaving? I've got to get the hang of this sponsorship thing. I am an independent podcast producer, so I'm hugely reliant on you for word of mouth and for spreading the word. I don't have a big company behind me. The only reason I've got this far is because of word of mouth from lovely people like yourselves. If you do like this podcast, please do leave a review, ideally a positive one, at your podcast repository of choice. And if you can hit the subscribe button, that helps me enormously as well. Apparently it lets me dance around algorithms and all kinds of stuff I don't understand, but I'm very happy to pass the message on. I'm going to move forward now to the start of the 2000s. I'm going to play you a clip from the second of the two films I'm talking about in this podcast. This one doesn't have quite so many Arnie puns in it, but it's got a few gags. Here's that clip.
Hello.
I'm gonna kill you. I'm gonna slice you up.
Who is
I'm
this?
gonna chop you like liver.
What do you want?
I'm in the house. Do you know where I am? I could be anywhere. I'm like the wind, baby. Yeah. Where am I?
You're behind the couch.
What? How do you know that?
I can see your feet.
That then is a clip from 2000's Scary Movie, directed by Keenan Ivory Wayans. Writing credits, well, these get complex. Sean Wayans, Marlon Wayans, Buddy Johnson, Phil Bowman, and Jason Freeberg and Aaron Seltzer. Coming to those two shortly. The cast for this one, led by then newcomer Anna Faris, also in there Regina Hall, John Abrahams, Carmen Electra, Shannon Elizabeth, and generally a young ensemble spoofing the Scream franchise. Now, that's basically where this started. That the latter part of the 1990s had brought the slasher movie back to the box office and in some style. First there was Scream in 1996, which was a surprise hit that spawned a franchise. Scream went under the working title of Scary Movie at one point, that's relevant. Then eyebrows were raised further, and the realisation that this was not a one-off thing when a film called I Know What You Did Last Summer hit big too. Others weren't that far behind. I mean, the urban legend franchise came along, Scream sequels. But amongst the audience for these movies was Sean Wayans. Now, he, along with his brother Keenan Ivory Wayans, well, they'd had, not a hit, but a success. So it's well worth seeking out with 1988's I'm Gonna Get You Sucker. They also then put together the film Don't Be a Menace to South Central While Drinking Your Juice in the Hood in 1996. That was directed by Paris Barclay. It's worth noting, too, that Keenan Ivory Wayans would write and direct A Low Down Dirty Shame in 1994, in which he also starred. But watching Scary Movie, Wayans figured out that the genre was ripe for a spoof, and he chatted to his brothers about it. So he chatted to Keenan and Marlon Wayans, and they were on board. And they started between them penning a screenplay that would send up Scream. Now, there was a film in the 90s called National Lampoon's Loaded Weapon Part 1, where I think it was when Mel Gibson heard about that. That was a send up of the Lethal Weapon films, and Gibson says something along the lines of, well, how do you parody a parody? And to a degree, the same applied here, that Scream's tongue was already firmly in its cheek, and here they were making a comedy about something that was already sort of making a comedy of things. Sean Wayans would in fact reflect to Entertainment Weekly that it was a really, really hard film just to write, and Marlon too would tell Variety, we developed so many different versions of this movie. We worked with our brother Keenan, we wrote a black draft, a white draft, a high school draft and a college draft, and it wasn't until we really saw I Know What You Did Last Summer and Scream that it just kind of clicked for us. Now, at this stage, Keenan Ivory Wayans hadn't had the best of fortunes working in and around the Hollywood system when his sitcom In Living Colour that was set up at Fox, well, he left what's described as the groundbreaking comedy show, and there's a report on this in Entertainment Weekly around the time, where he left after 3 years, and as Keenan Ivory Wayans would say of Fox in that Entertainment Weekly article, this is a shell of a company making desperate moves. They're collapsing and they don't care who they offend or what shows they ruin. It was moving forward a few years then that they started work on this spoof project, and the idea went to Bob Weinstein. Now, Bob Weinstein was part of Miramax with his brother, the convicted rapist Harvey Weinstein, and Bob headed up the Dimension Films label, part of Miramax, which had put Scream through. And when the idea came to him, well, he was happy to take the plunge. He had the reasoning that if anybody was going to do a spoof of Scream, why shouldn't it be them? But also, what Dimension was juggling was two competing projects here. That even though the script wasn't even complete when Dimension said it was going to go ahead with it, there was another film that was being put together by writers Jason Friedberg and Aaron Seltzer. They'd pitched something called Scream If You Know What I Did Last Halloween, whereas the Wayans team had pitched what they were calling Last Summer I Screamed Because Halloween Fell on Friday the 13th. So what Dimension did is it figured, let's effectively merge these projects, and that's why Friedberg and Seltzer got credit, even though the Wayans team basically said that their script was barely used. Casting was going to be a real challenge for this, because this was suddenly a project that was coming together really quite quickly, that it needed to take advantage really of the bubble in these slasher films at this point, that if it was going to ride on the coattails of Scream to a degree, and Scream 3 was due out around the same time, they had to get cracking. So the lead role is Cindy Campbell. Now, if you look back at films, I mean, it's inevitable, look back at the work of Leslie Nielsen. There was a serious actor who was cast in comedy roles in Airplane and Naked Gun just because he played things completely straight, and there was a degree of influence there. I think that what Keenan Ivory Wayans was looking for was someone who could just play this innocently, who wouldn't be overtly playing it for comedy. It wasn't early in the casting process either that Anna Faris, who would ultimately land the role, was seen by the casting team, because at this point she was new in acting. She didn't have an agent. She read for the role. Her audition had actually been shot by her mum, and she got a neighbour to help out with the second audition as well. But when Keenan Wayans saw her tape, and it was reluctantly really that the tapes were in passing, and may as well have a look at this, he was impressed with what he saw. And in fact, what he was also drawn to was the fact that she hadn't done much before, and that really kind of worked perfectly for what they needed, because what Wayans was after was a character of Cindy to have an innocence and a naivety to her, and he saw that in Faris's tape. Now, Faris has talked about this a little bit in her memoir, Unqualified, and she said, when I auditioned for the role, I had no idea what I was doing. I just knew that it was my first big Hollywood audition, and I wanted the part. I didn't know this at the time, but acting in a spoof movie requires a weird skill set because it calls for a degree of earnestness, and if nothing else, I was incredibly earnest back then. And in fact, I mean, she talks about it a little bit more in the book. And she said when she got the role, and she was ultimately cast in the film, of course, she called her friend and former college roommate, someone called Claire, to tell her. And Claire was thrilled. But then when she told her friend it was a spoof comedy, her friend turned to her and said, "Anna, you're not funny." And Faris writes, "It wasn't mean, it was true." And she said, "I know, I don't know what I'm going to do." Now, there were other names in the casting mix for this one. That Alicia Silverstone was reportedly offered the role of Cindy. Jared Leto reportedly turned the film down so he could go and do Requiem for a Dream instead. Britney Spears was said to have been sounded out for the movie as well. But the rest of the ensemble came together fairly quickly. Marlon Wayans in there, Regina Hall, John Abrahams, the names I read you at the start, and it was in place for filming to begin on the 16th of August 1999. The movie was shooting, because it was on a modest budget, although ironically it was just going to cost slightly more than the first Scream film to put together. Scream had cost $15 million to make. Scary Movie would cost $19 million to make, but it was going to shoot in Canada. That helped keep the cost down as well. And from the off, there was never any doubt which films were being spoofed. I remember reading interviews at the time where Keenan Ivory Wayans talked about the fact that he had a video of Scream by the camera. So when he was, for instance, shooting the sequence that spoofs the opening of Scream with Drew Barrymore, when he was shooting that sequence, he had the video there so he could reference exactly what the previous film had done, so that he could capture it for what he was trying to do. The actors were encouraged to look around as well at what others in the genre have been up to. So Regina Hall, she was encouraged to watch the role played by Jada Pinkett Smith in Scream 2. Shannon Elizabeth, meanwhile, well, she was mirroring Jennifer Love Hewitt's work in I Know What You Did Last Summer. And there was a lot of improvisation encouraged too. Entertainment Weekly ran a retrospective article on it where it brought the key players back in the film. And Shannon Elizabeth said that Keenan Ivory Wayans had said, "I want you to shoot what's on the page, and then I'm going to let you guys do anything you want. At the end of the day, I'm going to use whatever's the funniest and the best, and I, as the director, will get credit for it." It's probably important to note that she laughed at that. I don't think that's as sinister as it sounds at all. In fact, she said, "I absolutely loved him for that." The film it wasn't a long shoot, this one. It would take just over 2 months to get the movie in the can, and by 18th of October 1999 it was pretty much wrapped up. Now, the film wasn't going to be released till the following summer, but nonetheless the test screenings began. And it became clear that this film was testing particularly well. So much so, in fact, that one of the things that Keenan Ivory Wayans was keen to do was to add in a pop culture joke at the last minute. So there's a sequence in the middle of the film where they do the what's up from the Budweiser commercials that had just spiked at the time, and they were able to film that relatively late and bring it into the film. They were also able to reference other films that were spiking up. So there's a bullet time spoof sequence from 1999's The Matrix, and they managed to turn that round fairly quickly. I think it was Juice Bigelow was the first to do a Matrix spoof. And so they were able, really, because they got the core of the film in place, just to play around with it a little more and just beef up the jokes as they were in post-production, and also as the test screenings were going through the roof. They came up with a tagline. Dimension came up with the tagline for it, which was "No shame, no mercy, no sequel," and that would prove to require a little bit of revision in the aftermath of the film's release. But before that release, the Writers Guild of America had to rule on who was going to be the credited writers of the movie, and so the script itself was developed by Sean Wayans, Marlon Wayans, and they worked with Buddy Johnson and Phil Bowman, and they'd worked together on the Wayans Brothers, their sitcom. The script from Jason Freeberg and Aaron Seltzer, though, well, it earned them credit on Scary Movie, that by which time the film was called Scary Movie. And so, again, even though Freeberg and Seltzer's contribution could charitably be said to be on the very, very minimal side, and again, I'm coming back to this again shortly, they got basically co-writing credit on the movie. Now, by the time the film actually came around to its release, Scream 3 had come out at the start of 2000, in February of 2000. That had gone on to be a hit, and that was said to be the trilogy closer at that point. A belated Scream 4 would follow. A fifth Scream film, at the point this podcast is being recorded, is due 12 months from now. Scary Movie, though, the confidence of Dimension can be best demonstrated by the fact that this got a July the 7th release in the US, and that's absolutely prime time, really. It's the one around the July the 4th weekend. It was going up against films like The Perfect Storm, starring George Clooney, The Patriot with Mel Gibson, also around at the time. Well, Bruce Willis was starring The Kid. That came about. Scary Movie overcame reviews that were on the hostile side. Some were all right, but generally spoof comedies never tended to review well. And the film outgrossed the film that it was spoofing. Its opening weekend was an astronomical $42.3 million, so basically roughly around the same level as Batman and Robin, as it happens. But also, its box office would continue to build. It would go on to gross $157 million in the US, another $121 million overseas. And, I mean, when Abrams would tell Variety, he said when it came out, it was the highest grossing R-rated film of all time. And I believe it was the highest grossing black or African American film of all time, one that set off an amazing legacy, which is that in terms of investment in black or African American productions, I don't think by any means we're 100% there yet, but it definitely helped. Now, this had opened other people's eyes. I mean, it's worth noting that Lionsgate had picked up a film starring Tom Arnold and Coolio called I Know What You Screamed Last Semester, that it would change the name of to Shriek If You Know What I Did Last Friday the 13th. That was also released in 2000, but that just didn't work as well. And it's credit to the Wayans brothers that they managed to capture what worked about this. They managed to make this spoof of a comedy, and also they managed to turn it into box office gold. I'm pulling up the American box office chart for the entirety of 2000. You look at the films that Scary Movie outgrossed: What Lies Beneath, Disney's Dinosaur, Erin Brockovich, Charlie's Angels, The Patriot, What Women Want, Gone in 60 Seconds, Castaway. All of them were in the slipstream of Scary Movie. The aftermath of it, well, it would, for a start, it would see sequels, and Keenan Ivory Wayans and his brothers would return for Scary Movie 2, although they would end up being released from the third film, let's just say that, by the Weinsteins. They found this out by reading the trade press one Christmas Eve, that they weren't going to be part of Scary Movie 3. And as Marlon Wayans would looking back would tell Variety, we probably could have sued or whatever, but part of us was like, all you can do is allow us to create something new. And he says, I could write a book on that whole thing, honestly. They definitely still owe us money, lots of money. What they did was really bad business. Aaron Seltzer and Jason Friedberg, meanwhile, well, they were the people who would be behind the likes of Date Movie and Epic Movie and films I'm going to go out and say are just not funny spoofs. They're the kind of films that give spoof movies a bad name, and they build it as from 2 of the 6 writers of Scary Movie, even though their contribution to the final cut of Scary Movie was on the questionable side. The Scary Movie films, it's worth noting as well, they just kept coming, and sequel after sequel followed, and they kept doing the business at the box office as well. That there were, in the end, 5 of them. It was David Zucker of Naked Gun who ultimately took them over, the last of which was released in 2013. Keenan Ivory Wayans, meanwhile, well, he would go on to do, in the aftermath of Scary Movie, the films White Chicks and Little Man, and juggling also producing and acting in various roles. Anna Faris, meanwhile, well, she would land a small role in Lost in Translation off the back of Scary Movie. She went and did an audition, she writes about this in a memoir, with Warren Beatty, and Warren Beatty talked about laughing at Scary Movie and enjoying the film. I think Anna Faris is a terrific comedy actor. I just don't think she had the breadth of film roles she deserved to necessarily showcase just what she was capable of. But I think in the first Scary Movie film in particular, she is just terrific. I think it's a real skill what she manages to do. I'm going to leave the last word on this one, though, to Regina Hall, who in one of those retrospective pieces just doubled down really on one of the core successes of Scary Movie. And she says it was huge to have an African-American director open an R-rated comedy that was that big. And it really was that big. It broke the ceiling for what was possible. It was a movie that was really diversely cast, and we saw young audiences gravitate toward that. It wasn't a white film, it wasn't a black film, it was just a movie. As it turned out, it would be several movies in the aftermath of that. And whilst not every element of Scary Movie, I'd suggest, as its creators have acknowledged, has stood the test of time, it's one of the few spoofs in recent decades, really, since the peak of the Naked Gun series, that's really actually managed to generate an awful lot of laughs. Which brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories, sponsored by those fine folks at Mutiny Shaving. Do please support them if you can. You can get more of my waffling on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can get more from the entire Film Stories project at Film Stories Pod. Over at our website, filmstories.co.uk, every weekday there are new features, long-form features going up telling more film stories, as well as a mix of movie news and reviews. If you go to store.filmstories.co.uk, meanwhile, well, you can find our range of magazines there. We have Film Stories magazine, which comes out pretty much every month. The current issue now on sale. Film Stories Junior magazine for under 15s, primarily written by under 15s as well. If you'd like to support our independent publishing work, store.filmstories.co.uk. We're on Facebook at facebook.com/filmstoriesonline. You can find us on YouTube as well at youtube.com/filmstories. As always, though, the most important thing here is you all take care of yourselves. I mean, at the point this is being recorded, we're still locked down. We're going to be locked down lockdown for a few more weeks. Thank goodness we got films. Thank goodness we still got each other as well. Thank you for lending me your eardrums. Thank you for letting me waffle on about movies. I'll be back soon with another bunch of film stories, but until then, you all take care. Bye-bye.